Welcome to Daily Life in the Past. Here, we explore how ordinary people lived before modern technology and comfort shaped everyday life. If you enjoy learning about the past, feel free to leave a comment and let us know where you are watching from. And if you would like to support the channel, a like or subscription is always appreciated. Routine eating is one of the most basic survival skills. It is not just about taste or tradition. It is about keeping a body working, using limited supplies wisely, and reducing the risk of hunger in a world where food could be uncertain. Before modern refrigerators, supermarkets, and fast transportation, most people lived close to the edge of shortage. Even when there was enough food in a region overall, an ordinary household still had to manage daily problems: grain that spoiled, meat that went bad, fuel that ran out, animals that got sick, and weather that changed plans. In many times and places, survival depended less on having rare special foods and more on repeating a dependable pattern with common foods. This video explains routine eating as survival. It focuses on predictability and planning. It also examines how daily eating habits worked in historical life across different periods. The goal is not to romanticize the past. It is to show how routines helped people make hard conditions manageable. First, what is routine eating in a survival sense? Routine eating means eating in a predictable pattern, similar foods, similar times, and similar portion rules repeated day after day. It does not always mean eating the exact same meal. It means keeping the food system steady so that people can plan labor, fuel use, storage, and sharing. In a modern setting, many people can decide what to eat based on preference. In earlier periods, choice was limited. A routine was often shaped by the main staple available, such as grain, roots, or rice. Local fuel sources like wood, charcoal, dung, or crop waste. Work schedules tied to daylight, religious rules about fasting or permitted foods. The need to stretch stored foods until the next harvest. The need to feed children, workers, and elders reliably. Routine eating was also closely tied to household organization. In many societies, the household was the center of survival planning. The kitchen, the storage space, and the tools for grinding, baking, brewing, or boiling were as important as the field. Why predictability matters for survival? Predictability reduces risk. In a world where food could suddenly become scarce, routines worked like a safety system. A predictable eating plan made it easier to estimate how long supplies would last. If a household had grain, beans, or dried foods stored, they still needed rules for how fast to use them. If people ate large amounts whenever food was available, they risked running short later. If they ate too little, they risked weakness, sickness, and reduced work capacity. Routine helped find a middle path. Predictability also reduces waste. Many historical foods spoiled quickly. Milk turned sour. Cooked food could go bad if it sat too long. Meat spoiled without careful salting, drying, smoking, or cool storage. Even grain could be lost to dampness, insects, or rodents. A routine helped households match cooking to real needs. Cooking too much wasted fuel and food. Cooking too little forced extra cooking sessions, which also used fuel and time. Predictability supports labor. Most people in history did heavy physical work: farming, hauling water, grinding grain, caring for animals, building, or craft work. The body needs steady energy for this. A predictable meal schedule helped people know when they would have strength and when they needed to conserve it. Meal routines were often shaped by daylight. Without electric lighting, people generally rose early and slept earlier. This influenced cooking and eating times. It also shaped how many meals were practical. Planning is not only about food. It is also about time and fuel. A cooking fire requires fuel. Fuel had to be gathered, carried, dried, and managed. In many places, fuel was scarce. So routine eating often favored foods that could be cooked efficiently. Boiling a pot of grain porridge, stew, or pottage could be efficient because it could feed many people, use cheaper ingredients, and be stretched with whatever was available. In many societies, bread was a key survival technology. Bread is a way to turn stored grain into portable calories. It can be carried to fields, eaten without reheating, and shared in measured portions. Where bread was common, daily life often involved regular cycles of grinding grain, making dough, baking, and rationing. In other places, rice or other grains played a similar role. The staple is the anchor of routine. Across many historical societies, the center of routine eating was the staple food. A staple has three major survival advantages. First, it stores well. Grain, dried beans, and certain roots can be stored for long periods if kept dry and protected. Second, it is predictable. Staple crops produce a known amount of food per field. That made planning possible at both household and state levels. Third, it can be divided and measured. Staple foods can be portioned in ways that help control consumption. Because staples were so important, routine eating often meant staple plus small additions. The additions might be vegetables, oil, salt, fermented foods, or small amounts of meat or fish when available. The additions mattered for nutrition and morale, but the staple was the survival base. Meal timing and the structure of the day. When people talk about breakfast, lunch, and dinner, that is not a universal historical pattern. In many periods, especially in parts of Europe, two main meals were common, a main meal earlier in the day and a lighter meal later. Breakfast, in the modern sense, could be small, optional, or even socially discouraged among certain groups. This does not mean people never ate in the morning. It means that the meal structure was different. What counted as a meal often depended on social class, work needs, and cultural ideas. For manual workers, eating early could be necessary. For elites, the first meal might be later because their schedules and labor demands were different. The key survival point is that meal timing followed energy needs and daylight. Early meal structures also connected to fuel use. If cooking required lighting a fire, people might avoid extra cooking sessions. That encouraged fewer, larger cooking events, with leftovers used carefully. Now let us look at how routine eating worked in several historical settings. Ancient Rome, routine meals and social structure. In ancient Rome, sources describe a pattern of named meals, a morning meal, a midday meal, and the main meal later. Traditionally, breakfast was called ientaculum, and it could be eaten early. A midday meal, prandium, could be lighter. The main meal, cena, shifted over time and could become later and more elaborate for the wealthy. But routine eating looked different depending on class. For working people, routines followed work rhythms. A simple morning meal might be bread or porridge-like foods, and the rest of the day's eating depended on what was practical. For elites, eating could become a longer social event, but even then, routine mattered. Elite households relied on predictable supplies, grain, olive oil, wine, and preserved foods. The Roman world also shows how routine eating depends on systems beyond the household. Cities required supply chains, grain shipments, markets, storage, and distribution. The survival routine of an urban population depended on stable flows of staples. So in Rome, routine eating was both a personal habit and a larger system. Medieval and early modern Europe, two main meals and staple-centered diets. In much of medieval Europe, a two-meal pattern was common, a main meal around late morning or midday, and a lighter supper later. This pattern was shaped by work in agriculture and the need for daylight. People often did their heaviest work early and needed a solid meal to continue. Bread, pottage, and ale were common survival foods. Pottage was a thick soup or stew made from grains and vegetables, sometimes with small amounts of meat or fat when available. It had survival advantages. It allowed flexible ingredients. It could stretch small amounts of protein. It could be cooked in one pot. It was warm and filling. Bread was a daily anchor. In many places, it was the most important food. Households planned around grain supplies, milling, and baking. Routine eating also intersected with religious calendars. Many Christian communities had rules about fasting and meatless days. These rules shaped routines by creating predictable cycles, certain foods on certain days. Even when people did not have many choices, the calendar still guided planning. In early modern England, mealtimes were often described as dinner near midday and supper in the evening. Breakfast could be small or informal for many people, especially in working households. Again, the key survival idea is not the exact clock time. It is that meals were organized to fit work, fuel, and storage. Ancient Egypt, rations and organized feeding. Ancient Egypt shows another survival form of routine eating, ration systems. Large projects and state institutions required feeding many workers. Bread and beer were common ration items because they could be produced in bulk from stored grain and issued in measurable amounts. This is routine eating at an organized scale. Rations are a survival tool because they turn food into a stable plan. They link labor to food supply. They also require administration, storage, measurement, and distribution. For a worker, predictable rations reduce uncertainty. For a state, predictable rations support large labor forces. This also shows an important point. Routine eating does not always mean choice. Sometimes it means allocation. In ration systems, people depend on regular deliveries. That creates a different kind of predictability. You may not pick your meals, but you can count on certain basics. Imperial China and the logic of scheduled meals. In many parts of China across long periods, daily eating routines were closely tied to grain staples and household labor. One visible example from imperial life is that formal meal schedules could be limited to 2 main meals in a day, with other food taken as needed. This shows that even at the highest levels, routine could be shaped by culture, schedules, and ideas about health and order. For ordinary households, routine eating often meant cooked grain foods as the base, vegetables and preserved items as regular additions. Seasonal changes handled through drying, pickling, and fermentation. Clear household rules about who eats first and how much. As in other places, routine was a way to make sure supplies lasted. Routine eating and preservation, planning across seasons. Routine eating is not only daily, it is seasonal. The biggest survival challenge in many farming societies was the gap between harvests. When harvest came, food was relatively abundant, but it could spoil if not preserved. When winter or dry seasons came, people depended on stored foods. So families and communities built yearly routines, harvest and store grain, dry or salt meat and fish. Preserve vegetables by drying, pickling or fermenting. Store fats and oils when possible. Plan slaughtering at times when cold weather helped preservation. Routine eating also helped people use preserved foods correctly. For example, a small amount of salted meat could be used as flavor in a pot, rather than eaten as a large portion. This stretches protein while keeping meals satisfying. Fermented foods also supported routine. Fermentation can make food safer and longer lasting. It can also improve flavor and digestibility. Many societies developed fermented staples or side foods as a regular part of daily eating. Fuel, cookware, and the one-pot logic. A major limit on eating patterns was cooking technology. If you have one pot, one hearth, and limited fuel, you develop a routine that fits those limits. One-pot meals are common in many historical settings because they are efficient. They also support group feeding. The routine might look like this: start the fire once or twice a day, boil a staple with vegetables or legumes, add fat, salt or leftovers for flavor, serve in bowls, often with bread or another staple. Use leftovers carefully if safe. This routine reduces fuel costs, reduces time spent cooking, and provides predictable calories. Routine eating and social order inside the household. Routine eating also created a stable social structure. In many societies, meals were not served randomly. Households had rules about who eats first, who gets larger portions, how food is shared with guests, how much is saved for the next day, how children and elders are fed. These rules were part of survival planning. For example, a household might prioritize feeding active workers because the household needed their labor to produce future food. At the same time, feeding children and elders protected the family's long-term stability and social duty. Even when rules were unfair by modern standards, they often had a survival logic in the context of limited food. Routine eating also supported discipline. A predictable meal schedule reduces conflict over food. When everyone knows what to expect, there is less daily negotiation. Routine eating in towns and cities, markets, wages, and timing. Urban routine eating depended on markets. In many cities, people did not grow their own food. They relied on wages and supply systems. This created different survival pressures. Price changes could affect daily diet quickly. Supply disruptions could cause immediate shortages. Workers needed meals that fit long work hours. Street foods and cheap staples became important. Urban routines often focused on affordable, filling foods. These could be breads, porridges, noodles, or stews sold in portions. In later industrial settings, meal timing also became connected to factory hours. Work schedules could be strict. That pushed people toward routine meals that could be packed, eaten quickly, and repeated daily. Routine eating was not only cultural tradition. It was a solution to the problem of feeding a workforce on a schedule. The changing meaning of dinner, supper, and tea. Even the names of meals show how routines changed. In English-speaking history, dinner often meant the main meal, which for many people was earlier in the day. Over time, in many places, dinner shifted later as work patterns, lighting, and social habits changed. In some working communities, the evening meal was called tea, and a later light meal could be supper. In wealthier patterns, luncheon could be midday, with dinner later. These changes matter because they show that routine eating adapts to systems. When people had better lighting and different work schedules, the main meal could move. When factory work fixed the day into blocks, meal breaks became structured. So routine eating is always tied to how life is organized. Routine eating and health, steady energy and risk management. Routine eating also mattered for health. Even without modern nutrition science, people observed patterns. Certain foods kept workers strong. Certain foods spoiled and caused illness. Regular eating helped maintain strength. Too much rich food could cause discomfort. Too little food caused weakness. A routine diet reduced sudden changes. Sudden changes could upset digestion or expose people to spoiled foods. Routines also allowed people to use foods that were safe and familiar. In many periods, water safety was a problem. Beverages like beer, weak ale, or other cooked drinks could be safer than untreated water in some settings. This encouraged routine drinking patterns linked to meals. At the same time, it is important not to simplify. People still got sick from food and drink, and sanitation varied widely. But routine eating was one way people tried to control what they could. Routine eating under scarcity, stretching, substitution, and portion rules. When times were hard, routines became more strict. Households used strategies like stretching, adding more water and vegetables to stews, substitution, replacing scarce grains with cheaper ones, portion control, smaller servings with more frequent hot drinks, flavoring with small amounts of fat, salt, or fermented foods, reducing waste, using all edible parts of plants and animals. Routines could also shift based on price. If bread grain became expensive, people might rely more on legumes or cheaper starches. If meat was scarce, it might be used mainly as seasoning. This is routine eating as survival planning under stress. Routine eating and the psychology of predictability. Routine helps people manage uncertainty. In harsh conditions, knowing that there will be a meal at a certain time, even if it is simple, supports daily functioning. A predictable meal structure helps people pace their work, helps children and elders maintain stability, reduces daily decision pressure, supports cooperation in group settings. In many historical settings, the future was uncertain. Crops could fail, disease could spread, work could be seasonal, war or taxation could remove stored food. In that context, routine eating was a form of practical order. It turned food into a schedule and a system, not just an item to consume. How routines were taught and maintained. Routine eating was learned early. Children learned what foods were normal, how portions were handled, and how meals fit into the day. Food skills were also routine skills: grinding grain, managing a fire, baking or boiling, preserving foods, storing foods safely, measuring and rationing. In many households, these skills were essential. Without them, supplies could be wasted. So routine eating depended on knowledge passed down through daily repetition. Routine eating and inequality. Routine eating was not the same for everyone. Wealthier households could afford more variety, more meat and fats, more refined grains, more sugar and imported foods in later periods, more servants to manage cooking and storage. Poorer households often relied on simple staples, seasonal vegetables, less protein, more risk from price shocks, less storage space and fewer preservation options. But both rich and poor used routines. The difference was that the rich could build routines around preference and status, while the poor built routines around survival and cost. Even in elite households, routines still mattered because food supply and preparation were complex. Large kitchens, planned meal times, and storage systems were ways to manage that complexity. Across time, what stays consistent? Across many historical periods, several patterns repeat. First, the staple is central. Whether it is wheat, barley, rice, maize, or other staples, routine eating is built around the most reliable calorie source. Second, routine reduces risk. A predictable pattern makes it easier to plan storage and avoid waste. Third, meal timing matches systems. Meals follow the structure of work, daylight, and fuel availability. Fourth, preservation shapes the menu. What people ate daily depended on what could be stored safely. Fifth, routine is social. Meals organize households, workplaces, and communities. What changes is the system around the routine. When markets expand, routines change. When work becomes industrial, routines change. When lighting and technology improve, routines change. But the core survival function remains. Routine eating is a way to make limited resources last and keep bodies working. Routine eating as a survival technology. It can help to think of routine eating as a kind of technology. Not a machine, but a method. A method for turning uncertain food supplies into a stable daily life. In many historical settings, people could not control weather, disease, taxation, or conflict. But they could control portions, cooking schedules, and preservation habits. That control mattered. It meant that a household could plan. It meant that workers could function. It meant that communities could survive between harvests. Routine eating was not simply tradition, it was an answer to repeated problems. And that is why, across centuries and across cultures, humans returned to similar solutions: staple-based meals, measured portions, predictable meal times, and careful planning for tomorrow.